Welcome to the MacArthur Memorial podcast. I'm your host, Amanda Williams. Join me as we explore the life and legacy of General of the Army Douglas MacArthur and discuss a wide range of military history topics, from the American Civil War to the Korean War. On April 11th, 1951, at 1 a.m. Eastern Time, President Truman announced that he had relieved General Douglas MacArthur of his command. Just one problem: General MacArthur had not yet been told of his relief. So how did he find out? Well, I'm here today with Jim Zobel, one of the historians here at the MacArthur Memorial, and we are going to be talking about how MacArthur found out about his relief. So, Jim, why don't you get us started here? There are a lot of rumors and things about why MacArthur was fired. Can you give us the bullet points? Why does Truman make this decision?
Well, there is no great relationship between MacArthur and Truman. I mean, that's been spelled out, from the beginning of the occupation days into the occupation. They never had met until that Wake Island Conference of October of 1950. And throughout the occupation, there was always a lot of squabbling over policy and things like that. And Truman never visits Japan. Vice President never visits Japan. Secretary of State never visits Japan. And right at the beginning of the Korean War, you've got the problems with Formosa because MacArthur goes to visit Chiang, and then there's flights going into Formosa that are landing there, which is totally against American policy. Truman sends out Averell Harriman, who tells MacArthur, stop talking about China. We're not, we don't want to get them mixed up in the Korean War. So just keep that under the table. And MacArthur agrees. And then he releases that VFW message, which comes out and says that, we can never let Formosa go. It's an unsinkable aircraft carrier, totally violates Truman's policy. Truman says, recall that. But all that's kind of forgotten just because of Incheon and the rapid turn of events, because everything looks like it's going to be victory. Then the Chinese come in, and MacArthur, unlike any time before, because the press is just hammering him, getting caught with his pants down, and he goes to the press. And then Truman slaps that gag order on him. And so then you've got this fighting for the 38th parallel going on between Matthew Ridgway, the 8th Army commander, and the Chinese. And all this time you've got MacArthur making statements like this is a die for Thai war, violating the gag order. And he does that about 4 or 5 times until like late March, when Truman says he wants to get the Chinese to the table, and MacArthur issues a press statement to the Chinese general saying, "I've destroyed you, surrender now." Well, there went Truman's peace feeler. And so then they're talking about what, Truman's like, what am I going to do about MacArthur? Do I keep him in Japan? Do I bring him home? Do I keep Ridgway in Korea? And then MacArthur writes that letter to Joe Martin, the Republican in Congress, who's probably the most rabid anti-Truman Republican there is. And then he ends up reading MacArthur's letter on the House floor, which is all about, once again, violating that policy of don't talk about Red China and Formosa, because that's all MacArthur says. We have to use Chiang's troops. This is what we have to do. And so that's when Truman knows he's getting into the political realm within Washington and really getting into the diplomatic realm as far as, what the policy and the goal is in Korea. And so that's when Truman knows he has to get rid of them. And they'll have meetings with the vice president, the State Department head, with Defense Department head George Marshall, Paul Neitz of the State Department, and they'll come to the realization that, or Truman will, that MacArthur's not in league with policy, so they get rid of him. There's also the worry about the nuclear thing. Even though MacArthur never asked to use nuclear weapons in Korea during that period, at least, no evidence has been created of that. We did find out years ago that in Tokyo, they were bugging all the embassies. And so the Spanish and the Portuguese back in like November, December of 50 were sending all these messages back to their home offices saying that MacArthur trying to go the Soviets into World War III, but MacArthur said, these are so out of line with anything that's reality, which they were. I've seen these messages, but you got to throw in then Charles Willoughby, who's MacArthur's intelligence chief. He's very close to Salazar and Franco in Portugal and Spain. So, was he behind feeding these things? So we don't really know, but we do know that's what Truman said, that it was, because we knew he wasn't in league with what our policy is, because they want to get out of the war, status quo antebellum. They're worried about the Soviets going into Western Europe, and MacArthur's still wanting to win the war. To bring it to a successful conclusion, I guess all because of the World War I, lesson of the armistice. And so that's really what it comes down to is that Truman then decides that he's gonna have to replace MacArthur.
So how does MacArthur actually find out? Where is he when he gets this news?
Well, he's at the embassy. Like, they have every day they'll have lunch at the embassy, and MacArthur will have visiting people that are visiting Japan or Tokyo, whether it be political or advisors to the occupation, things like that. And when they announce it at 1:00 in Washington, that is lunchtime in Tokyo. And so somebody in the embassy hears it on the radio, because they announced it, on the radio before it got a chance to get to MacArthur, because Undersecretary of the Army Pace, who was in Korea, was supposed to come tell MacArthur, but then the Chicago Tribune, Walter Trohan, was going to scoop that story. And so they announced it at like 1:00 in the morning. And that was before Pace was able to get to see MacArthur. And so whoever heard it in the MC, it might have been Sid Huff, but they tell Sid Huff, and he's MacArthur's aide, had been his aide since World War II. And he tells Gene, and Gene goes and tells MacArthur at the table, there, that, it's just been over the radio, you've been relieved of commands. And MacArthur was supposedly like, I guess we're going home. Then they contact GHQ, and they get the radio message that did come from Washington from the Joint Chiefs, announcing that MacArthur had been relieved of command.
Now, I know obviously there's concern about the story being scooped, and the White House wants to be the lead on that. But is there any truth to the claims that Truman was also concerned that MacArthur may resign before he could be relieved?
That I don't know. I don't see them as thinking he would resign. The thing is it's that going against policy rather than insubordination. A lot of people say it's because of insubordination, but when they have those May hearings before Congress, all the Joint Chiefs say no. He followed every order. It was just that he wasn't in line with what we were doing. We know that MacArthur tells Almond, like a week before, his 10th Corps commander, that he felt he had become involved politically and he might be going home. So I think MacArthur knew what the import of that letter that he wrote was, especially after Martin reads it on the House floor, that, it is a big thing. And that's, that was what, April 5th. So it was about a week right before he gets fired, right around the time he tells Almond that. So, it could have been that they just, that he realized it had been read, and now he's, really in the fray with these people.
He definitely knew it was coming. I think you and I both agree on that, especially after he has that conversation with Almond and said, I'm political now. So he knew it was coming, but maybe he was thinking he might skirt that too.
I think, it was just the way in which it was done that I think, really irked him, 52-year career. And I got to hear about it over the radio, that you've let me go. But, it just happened that way because of the political thing. When he meets with Ridgway, because Ridgway's going to be SCAP now, and he meets with him, and Ridgway said that he was in there, wondering if Truman was a drunk for just making irrational decisions, because it had just come out in the press, I think not too long before that Truman threatened to beat up some reporter, that trashed his daughter's singing ability. And so I think MacArthur's just like, who's this wild man in the White House, and we know what Truman thought of MacArthur, Mr. 5-star brass hat prima donna. He said that even before World War II was over. So, they definitely didn't understand each other, didn't know each other. And then, the JCS had never had a very, especially after the Chinese come in, nobody in Washington has a very comfortable relationship with MacArthur after that. The people in Tokyo do, and Truman will send out that guy Frank Lowe, he wants him to assess MacArthur, and Lowe comes out there and thinks MacArthur's the greatest. But he thinks that Truman's the greatest too. He just thinks that these two people have not had a chance to get to know each other. So I think Truman had enough, and I think, MacArthur had enough. MacArthur MacArthur still wanted to win it.
Yeah, I think so. So, what is the response to the relief around the world?
Well, the British, I think, and the Europeans were glad about it. They'd been worried about MacArthur for a while. The British still have trade going on in Hong Kong, during this whole time. The Russians and the Chinese love it because he's gone. I think the people in America are kind of flabbergasted because they didn't understand there was any problems underlying everything. In the press, everything seemed to be hunky dory, a few things, but then all of a sudden, just overnight, I'm firing you. That kind of shocked everyone. I think after they have those hearings and it comes out that the Joint Chiefs and MacArthur weren't really in line with the way they were thinking, I think then America kind of loses that fervor. And what's the story? Like MacArthur's at that baseball game, and all of a sudden, somebody yells out, "Hey, Mac, how's Harry Truman?" And he knew that the
Right.
the reverence and the
Yeah.
was over, and the disrespect, was by the American public, was once they start laughing at you, that's kind of it. Not that anybody was laughing, but just
No,
probably didn't like that situation.
I don't think he'd ever been exposed to ridicule
No,
in a
right.
public way
Yeah.
like that.
Yeah.
No.
Yeah. Especially when, he was so convinced that he was doing right. I mean, he saw it as kicking the can down the road, and for future generations. And I mean, that pretty much came true.
I maybe you'll disagree, but I think Truman and MacArthur respect each other more years later than during the time when they were supposed to be working together. I think it definitely by the time MacArthur's, at the end of his life, I think there's that. And then I think, years after his relief, I think he thinks, wow, Truman was tougher
Yeah.
than I thought he was,
And he says that, he says that a number of times. I think he realized he was a very shrewd, and he's a Missouri guy who's quick with the tongue, but he's very adept at understanding a lot of different things and a lot of different people.
And what about the Japanese? What is their response to his relief?
Well, it's different all the way around. It's like I told you before. I think the Miyazawa, who was the Japanese finance minister, like it doesn't really matter. He's gone. We got somebody else coming. They're looking to the peace treaty that's coming. So I think a lot of people were knowing that it was going to end, some point. But it's, I think the big thing for the Japanese is they got to see up close the lesson, that the civilian runs the military in American democracy. And that was probably a very, very important, lesson and something that happened. I mean, they pour out, for the leaving. I mean, the streets are lined from Tokyo down to Haneda Air Base with millions of people and all the governments there at Haneda. And, we have all the different resolutions that comes from all over Japan, thanking MacArthur. So I mean, it was a great outpouring. I think that changes after those hearings, though, because MacArthur makes that statement where he likens Germany, America, and Japan to their experience with democracy. He, assigns, like the German and the American experience with democracy, it would be like for a 45-year-old man. That would be like a 45-year-old man. Whereas the Japanese experience with democracy, that would be a 12-year-old. And so all the Japanese here, he thinks we're childlike, he thinks we're children here, that we don't have the ability. And so like, basically it was like, any respect or admiration like was right out the window, because of that statement. So, I mean, it changed rather rapidly.
It's always so complicated, isn't it?
Yes, it is.
So, any final thoughts on MacArthur and how he finds out that he's been fired?
Well, the one thing that I don't think a lot of people know is that after he gets fired, Bonner Fellers, who had worked with MacArthur in World War II, and he had been a big part of the early part of the occupation, he's real close with Herbert Hoover, who's like one of the only people that MacArthur really respects, And Fellers gets Hoover on the phone with MacArthur before he comes back. And Hoover lays out what he needs to do, how he needs to talk to the American people. There needs to be this moral, resurgence within America. They're falling out of line. And these are the things you need to say. And he pretty much outlines what MacArthur says in the address to Congress. The old soldiers never die speech. He's like, you talk about this, you talk about this, you talk about this. And so it's very, very much MacArthur's like, I'm not going to talk to anyone. But when Fellers is like, Hoover wants to talk to you, MacArthur's like, okay, and he listens.
Well, thank you, Jim. That was very interesting as always. I appreciate your time. Stay tuned. When we originally released this program, we used our social media platforms to invite listeners to ask questions about MacArthur's relief. What follows is that bonus Q&A. Well, we are back, Jim and Amanda, here at the MacArthur Memorial, and it's time for some question and answers about MacArthur's relief by President Truman. So we will just get right into the questions. So, Jim, question number 1. What effect did relieving MacArthur of duty have on Truman's political career? Do you think it played a role in his brief 1952 re-election campaign?
Yeah, he doesn't even run, does he?
He sort of. I think there's a primary challenger, and I think he loses the New Hampshire primary to someone else.
Yeah.
So, he's out quickly.
It was detrimental to both of them, I think, the whole flare up and whatnot. But I didn't realize that he had tried to do that.
I think maybe I'm wrong on that, but I think he did briefly, but I don't think he's in very long.
Right.
But I think he also has an approval rating of 29%. So it hurts him. My impression is that firing MacArthur certainly didn't help. I think it splits up a lot of moderate Democrats and Southern Democrats from supporting him.
Okay.
But I think more than that, it's kind of the stalemate in Korea. People are tired of war, but we've won World War II and we've won it well.
Yeah.
And then this war goes into stalemate, and I think people are just like, what is going on here?
When does Ike get into it?
53?
Well,
52.
Because he wins the election.
Yeah.
But I'm wondering, once Ike declares, I think that's at the convention that they figured that out, that he'll get the vote.
Right.
But because once Ike declares, I think the writing's on the wall.
Right.
That Truman's probably you got every GI from World War II's
gonna vote
for Ike, So that's probably got I don't know when the time frame is, but it seems like that would probably weigh on Truman more than the MacArthur thing.
And then it makes you think back of when MacArthur's telling him, "Look, it's not going to be me running against you; it's going to be Ike."
Yeah.
So, but no, I don't think that. I think it was probably a confluence of a number of events, and it's a perfect storm for him in the end. So, but I think MacArthur's firing is just one factor in all of that.
Yeah.
I have to read up more on that timeline. All right, second question. What was the relationship between Truman and MacArthur like in later years? What positive things did Truman say about MacArthur?
I don't think he ever said anything positive about him later on. They get in the big fight in 54 that goes into Life magazine. And then Truman, says in 60 that MacArthur wanted to use nuclear weapons, and MacArthur calls him on that one. And then even after MacArthur's gone, he keeps going back to it. And I think there's one of those books that talks about, his advisors are just like, would you just let it go already?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
He does send that telegram to MacArthur on his deathbed, really.
Mm-hmm.
But
which is nice.
Yeah. But I think that he couldn't get over it as much as MacArthur was able to get over it.
Mm-hmm.
I think MacArthur blamed other people more than Truman.
I think he just thought Truman had some guts to do it.
Well,
fire him.
And he said that later. Yeah.
But I think Truman is asked at one point, was MacArthur the right person for this job? And he makes it very clear he was talented. He was the right I chose the right person in 1950 for the Korean War.
Yeah. There's talk that Leif Sverdrup, who's the guy who runs the Sverdrup Engineering, he'd been MacArthur's engineer, and he was from Missouri, and he knew Truman. And Larry Bunker, who was MacArthur's aide, they tried to get some kind of meeting with them later on, like a rapprochement type thing. It never came. to fruition. Neither of them were going to do that.
They weren't close and admiring each other from afar. There was still some hard feelings, but MacArthur had kind of moved on.
Yeah.
All right, next question. When did the myth of MacArthur requesting to use nuclear weapons against China first appear?
That I'm not sure. I wonder, because I can't remember if Revere and Schlesinger are the first ones that come out with the big book, The General and the President, about the conference. But, even if MacArthur, the talk and whatnot, would that have still been classified to even talk about that, So I'm not real sure. I mean, we know, of course, because of the, after he dies, there's all the, the talk of him using nuclear weapons. But I think that a lot of people were talking about it at the time. I don't know, because we have all the newspapers, but it doesn't, there's not really any kind of stories in there about that. And I think it's really, after he dies that people, see that, where he said, I would have dropped, 30 to 50.
Him thinking back years later saying, maybe we should have done this. Yeah. What ifs?
Yeah. Those interviews with Jim Lucas and Bob Considine.
Right.
Yeah.
But Truman mentions it in his interview with that Chicago TV station, though. This is one of the reasons I fired him.
That's probably the first, time that, but
and then he retracts that.
Because MacArthur says, show me where I ever said that. And then Truman says, well, I just thought he wanted to do that.
Next question. What was Truman's plan to end the Korean War when MacArthur communicated with China in March of 1951?
Well, I think he was wanting to get the Chinese to the table, to start talking, and pretty much go back to a status quo antebellum. When MacArthur sabotages that, he says later in that VFW speech he gives in Miami after he comes home, I think it's in the summer of 1951, and he said that in that speech that he sabotaged it because they were going to offer the Chinese a table at the United Nations, or a seat at the United Nations, and that was rewarding them for an undeclared war.
Okay.
And he would always call them a rogue nation, and so I that's why he does it. What's Truman's plan? I think he just wants to end it as soon as possible. Everybody was, at that point, we got to get out of here. Whereas Mao's just going to wait him out, until Stalin tells him to stop.
End it by armistice or end it?
But by armistice, coming to we're going to have a truce or whatnot,
Right, next
and
question.
that's what got him going because MacArthur kept having plans to win it.
Right. Next question: is there any credibility to the story of MacArthur talking to foreign ambassadors in Tokyo about how he would convince Truman to bomb China?
Well, MacArthur denies it. And we talked about in the broadcast that we did about the Spanish and the Portuguese, and what they're saying back. And MacArthur said, it's like I said, he said, this is so beyond anything that's real, which it is, a great deal of it was just, not true, what they were saying in those messages that were going back and forth, and I've looked at it to see if MacArthur met the Spanish ambassador. I think it was Ojeda or something like that at that time. And it didn't jive, with it at that point. But, we know what we know because of what we have on paper,
Right.
So, to say, did he meet those people at some other point? I don't know,
Next question, and I may mispronounce this. Tell us the story of the USS John A. Bull. Did I say that right?
Well, that's a story that's come out recently, and I guess in the past couple of years. And it's a story of a Navy ship. This guy's done all his work. He sent it to us actually. I just I haven't cataloged and gone through it all yet. But it's the story of this ship that supposedly MacArthur sent in to try and get the Chinese to attack the ship in the Formosa Straits, kind of. But does MacArthur have the capability or the command structure to tells certain ships where to go. I think that's the Navy, that does that, but like I said, I haven't read all this guy's thesis and everything yet. But he did send it to us. And so, eventually I will go through it, but that's about all I know. The guys on the ship said that they were surrounded by, Chinese and communists in small boats, trying to provoke them, and they were saying that they were put, within this certain limit, of
3 miles
yeah,
or
yeah.
something.
And they went beyond that and, were just sitting out there by themselves. But, I don't know enough about it to say hello.
And the ship's log says that that's not where they were.
Yeah.
So, but the sailors argue.
Yeah, they said that
the logs are incorrect.
Right. Yeah.
And that happens April 11th, 1952.
Yes, it's like the day he gets 51. Yeah, the day he gets relieved of command. But it's like I don't.
Is it possible
I don't
that
believe
was some sort of intelligent thing happening? Necessarily him.
I don't know.
Yeah.
I mean, the guy's done all the work. I just haven't seen it yet.
Last question. What kind of career do you think MacArthur would have had if he hadn't been relieved of duty? Would he have continued to serve after Korea, or would he have retired from an active role in the military?
I think he would have retired.
After Japan?
Because he was doing, he was going to stay through the peace treaty in Japan, and then the war comes up, and he gets thrown into that. But I mean, he's 71 at that point, so no, I don't think he would have had any other command after that. I think that he would have come home and probably had the same welcome that he had when he got even after he got fired.
And then maybe since he admired Pershing so much, he exercises influence in the army, maybe behind the scenes.
Well, I don't know, because all the people that are running the army are Ike's guys,
Ike's people, and then Ike's president.
I think that after that, Ridgway, Maxwell Taylor, those guys are in there. If Korea had gone differently, would MacArthur have had a better relationship with Ridgway? I mean, I don't think there's any animosity going between them, but there's MacArthur talks bad about him in that interview,
right?
In 54, and basically talks bad about all of them. The structure afterward, and he would always complain that none of his guys ever, got put into positions, which wasn't true because George Decker becomes the chief of staff, and he had been 6th Army, and then you've got Spencer Aiken, he becomes like your chief signal officer, 4-star. So I mean, it's I don't think he would have had any active role or anything like that.
No. Yeah. I think I agree. He's definitely, if the Korean War hadn't happened, I think he's out after the treaty with Japan is signed, comes home, heroes welcome. But I think he and Jean probably were hoping to return anyways, because Arthur had never been to the United States. He's getting older. They have to probably start thinking about the final stages of his education in college, and they're going to want to be home. Yeah. So.
No, I think so. Yeah.
But probably definitely an elder statesman of sorts.
Yeah, Eisenhower's in the White House, and they don't get along. They always talk about glowing fondness of our time together, but they don't get along.
Right.
I mean, because they'll say things back and forth, to other people. And I think when MacArthur comes to visit Eisenhower in 54 or something down at the White House. There's not much happening there.
Right.
So I think that they had a lot of water under the bridge.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. Well, that is the end of the questions. Thank you to everyone who sent those to us. And thank you, Jim, for your time as well.
Thank you, Amanda.
We hope you enjoyed that episode. If you have questions, comments, or topic suggestions, the MacArthur Memorial team wants to hear from you. You can reach us at macarthurmemorial@norfolk.gov or find us on X at MacArthur1880 or on Facebook and Instagram as MacArthur Memorial.